Today, it's just two dudes talking about the draft, making their last pitches as to what is going to happen. Let's get to it.
You are Locked On Colts, your daily Indianapolis Colts podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, what's up, everybody? Thanks for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day. This is your daily podcast covering your Indianapolis Colts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Again, what is up, everybody? Welcome to the show. I am Jake Arthur of HorseshoeHuddle.com. Joined by a very special guest. I've got the one and only Stephen Holder, who covers the Colts and the NFL for ESPN. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Hey, good to see you, Jake. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Now, you were with us the last week. I think our last episode last draft week, so I knew we had to do it again. We came out looking pretty on that one. You, me, and Zach all said Anthony Richardson, so we looked smart on that. We'll see if it turns out that way this year. But we're just kind of rolling through, kind of our final thoughts on the draft. What we think they need to address in there, what they might be able to maybe wait until after the draft and use some of that salary cap space on, and then ultimately what we kind of think might happen. So first up, they've kind of had the same needs all offseason. It seems like the severity of some of them has kind of varied now through some free agent moves. Right. Of course, really only in reinvesting in their own. Joe Flacco and Raekwon Davis are, backups, the only outside guys they brought in. Of course, you hope you don't see Joe Flacco. So essentially, they brought in one outside guy that you might see. So what do you think they most urgently need to come out of this draft with position-wise?
So I think the first thing to mention is that I actually don't think there are any needs that I would classify as urgent. There are needs. But they have put themselves in a decent position. I'm not saying they're a championship team. I'm not even saying they make the playoffs, right? None of us can really forecast any of that. The schedule will get tougher. The division's tough, all that. But they have a pretty well-rounded and pretty decently constructed roster that has talent across the roster at all units. So I think when you do that, you really put yourself in a strong position going into the draft, particularly when you have your quarterback, right? We knew that was going to be a game changer, having the quarterback. And I wrote a story recently, not to get off the subject, but I wrote a story recently because it dawned on me that this was a thing, that like the disposition has changed so much from having the quarterback. And not just because they had to consider drafting a quarterback some years. It was also they spent so many resources on quarterbacks. They've used they've used 2 first-round picks in the last few years on quarterbacks. Carson Wentz was a first and a third. They drafted Anthony. They spent later round picks drafting quarterbacks. They spent tens and tens of millions of dollars. So they're free from all of that now. And so they have all their picks. They don't have that pressure to at least consider a quarterback, even ones that they don't love. That is liberating, right? There's no question about it. So anyway, they don't have that pressure. And they also don't have, like I said, the immediate pressure of saying like, oh my God, we have to get position X in this draft because otherwise we got no shot. Now, that being said, they have definitely decided to live dangerously in their secondary. Okay, we know this, and Chris Ballard has shown that he's willing to take chances on particular units. In the past, he pointed out correctly last week that he did do this with the offensive line a couple years ago and was proven right. I would argue it's not the same situation. That was a very experienced offensive line that had Pro Bowl selections on it. They just had a bad year in 2022. So this is different. This is an unproven secondary that hasn't had that kind of success outside of Kenny Moore and to a lesser degree, Julian Blackmon. The rest of these guys are completely unproven. And I think that's the problem. I do think they are better than they displayed last year. Of course they are. They weren't on the field. But that's the thing. We don't know enough about them. I've made this argument. I'll make it again. Take, for example, Juju Brents. I think he's a talented guy. That's pretty clear. But we also have the reality here, which is like the results that he showed when he did play. He was up, he was down. It was never consistent, right? So we don't know who he truly is. It's a lot different than saying, in the case of Anthony Richardson, right? He only played 4 games. What are we talking about? There are people, I think, in other corners, I guess, around the league who are like, I don't know if this guy's the real deal. Well, if you really watched him, you don't really have a lot of doubts. Like, you saw the talent. It was compelling and clear. He just has to stay healthy. Mm-hmm. That is not the same thing as what we're talking about in the secondary. So I put that at the top of the list. I still think beyond that, there are questions among their pass rush, even though it was very productive last year. But I still think there are questions, not immediately, but maybe going forward, right? What is the future of Kwity Paye, for example? All these things. So that's kind of something to pencil in, maybe not write in pen, but pencil. And then obviously wide receiver, I think weapons are always going to be something that I see as a priority. And I just think with the depth of this draft at wide receiver, which Chris Ballard agreed is clear, there's a value opportunity there. It doesn't have to be in the first round, but look, I mean, in the first couple of rounds, there's a value opportunity there that matches with a potential need as well. So they're in a really good place, I think. Doesn't mean they're going to come out of this as some kind of Super Bowl contender, but they're in a position of strength to get what they need and to get some real talent out of this draft.
Yeah, they absolutely have needs, but I kind of view them as one of the best player available teams. Now, they do tend to draft their needs early on. Fortunately for them, again, in this draft, it looks like the value of the players that should be there at 15, or if they scoot down a little bit, it's there. Like, it's a pretty rich draft in what they need. But, looking at, I don't want to call it inactivity in free agency, because like they did spend a ton of money bringing back their own guys, like guys they wanted and who would have commanded a lot of money from other teams on the market. But like it is the same team essentially. And so on the surface, it looks like they are putting a lot of eggs in the Anthony Richardson basket and really relying on him and Shane Steichen to get them where they want to go. Mm-hmm. But we've heard from mostly Chris this offseason about, and especially Friday, protecting Anthony, which they brought back everybody from a really good offensive line. So check there. But then he also talked about giving him weapons, surrounding him with talent, which of course they did with re-signing Pitt. But we haven't seen more of that yet, which I kind of feel like this is where they're looking at it. Chris commented the offense, he complimented the offensive depth at the top of the draft. He has talked about wide receiver 2 or 3 times this offseason. So I kind of feel like that's where the splashes might come in this one.
I do think that there's an opportunity there. And look, if in fact their near-term future really does revolve around Anthony Richardson, and no one disagrees with that statement, then look, this is not groundbreaking to say you got to position him for success. But I also, that's a very obvious thing, right? But I also think there's something else to really harp on here, and it's one of the people you just mentioned. It's Shane Steichen. I think if you had just kind of this run-of-the-mill offensive coach, maybe you don't double down on your offense as much. I happen to think this guy is elite, at least as a play caller, as a strategist. I think he is he has to continually prove it, right? It's 1 year, but he shows indications of being an elite guy from a strategy perspective. If that's true, I think you feed the beast. At least there's an argument to feed the beast, right? It's not a very difficult argument to make, like, hey, this guy, our coach, is one of our greatest assets. So let's go there, right? And give him the weapons at his disposal. there's no better argument for that than last season, what he did with Gardner Minshew, right? We all saw it. And we know we love Gardner Minshew, but he definitely lifted the floor of Gardner Minshew's floor. There's no question about it. And certainly his ceiling was higher as well. So that is a direct correlation to the performance of the head coach. And all you can imagine, or you can imagine, him having more at his disposal, like Anthony Richardson, for example, a full season of Jonathan Taylor, things like that. And, what if you add to it beyond that? What then is he capable of? I really think the answer is we have no idea, but it could be amazing. So I think that's a big factor to think about. And the one good thing is that Shane Steichen, having proven himself in year one, if you're Chris Ballard and that scouting staff, you got to listen to this guy. If he says, I need something, you got to give him some benefit of the doubt there. And I really do think that he will be a guy who is vocal and will, be clear about what he needs and wants. It's interesting, not to get on a tangent, but I've always felt like Frank Reich could have done more of that, and say, sometimes you got to step up and say, damn it, this is what I need. and maybe that's not the way Frank Reich might say it, but the point is, I think we know Shane Steichen will say it in a colorful way. Okay. Yeah. And I'm all for that. I think you have to be, it's a combination of like confidence, and it's a combination of being assertive, all of those things. It doesn't mean that the general manager has to rubber stamp it. It just means that you got to have conviction about what you need and what you want and what you can provide if you have the weapons that you need. So anyway, there's a long-winded answer, but I really think Shane Steichen looms large in all of this. And I'm not just talking about the number 15 pick, but, throughout the draft, if there are players that fit what he wants to do, his vision, he has shown results, then you can lean into that confidently and say, all right, I'm going to trust our head coach here.
Yeah. And Chris, of course, is very flexible and wants it to be collaborative. He doesn't want to be the face of the show. He wants to get that input from the coaches. And this has been a big, different offseason for Shane and the coaching staff. I mean, this time last year, Shane said, they were still trying to install the offense and this and that, but Shane's been able to go to pro days this year. He was at the Senior Bowl. Like, he's a lot more involved with the scouting. So I definitely think that him and the whole staff are going to be pretty influential in this one. But coming up next, we're going to talk about kind of the options the Colts still have in free agency, because realistically, you don't get everyone or fill every position you want to get throughout the draft. So they do have some salary cap space. So what positions could they probably kind of wait to punt on in the draft? Game Time is now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app go down closer to the closer that it gets to the first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and the lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. They've got last-minute tickets and flash deals, and they make it easy to find and buy MLB tickets, really for any kind of event in your area. Obviously, here in Indy, we don't have the MLB, but we do have the Indians, which are the farm team for the Pirates. I was just on Game Time. They have Indians tickets. They've already got Fever tickets going. Obviously, Caitlin Clark, that's a very big deal. They got comedy club tickets. Any kind of entertainment you want in Indy, they have got you covered. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Okay, Steven. So the biggest recent news for the Colts was giving the extension to DeForest Buckner, player that has obviously been the heartbeat of that defense since 2020. Very well deserved. But interestingly enough, the Colts were a little uncharacteristic in how they restructured it, which now gives them $28.4 million approximately in cap space, according to Over the Cap. I think his hit is only like $8 million this year, which, normally he's a $20 million plus per year guy. But Chris was a little coy during his pre-draft presser the other day. He said, he acknowledged it gives them flexibility, although maybe he wanted to see Twitter squirm a little bit. But for me, I look at it and I say, realistically, maybe you want to add decent players in the secondary or, this and that in the draft, but it doesn't always fall how you want it to. And with this cap space, sure, they can roll it in the next year if you want to, but they do have that flexibility now to add a capable starting safety if they want, or another corner. So how do you kind of read the Buckner contract development?
Yeah, definitely a departure from the norm. That's for sure. I think there were a lot of initial questions from fans to I'm sure you and I both. What do we think that they have in the works? As though there was something imminent. I never thought it was something imminent, and there may be nothing substantial even to come at any point in the offseason. However, it's what you just said. It does at least put them in the conversation if an opportunity presents itself. And the timing is, I think, notable, because when do a lot of those opportunities tend to crop up? It's during the draft. There's a lot of player movement during the draft, be it trades or what have you. And even after the draft, you're going to have some cuts. You're going to have movement there. So to go from a situation where you basically had no flexibility whatsoever, and you really couldn't consider any substantive move, I think, beyond their draft class before the Buckner restructure or the extension. Before that, they really only had room for their draft class and smaller transactions. And really, for the Colts, we're still very early in the offseason, because they are a team that takes the approach that, look, we will keep all options on the table all the way up until opening day. So for them, again, I don't anticipate a huge move, but at least you can be in the conversation if something presents itself. So we'll see. I think it's not an acknowledgement necessarily that they haven't done a lot this offseason, but it is a little bit of an acknowledgement, because Chris Ballard he feels differently about that, right? Like he sees it differently. Like he sees it like, well, I kept a good team together, which I get. But it is at least an acknowledgement that, like, all right, we're not a finished product, right? And I think that is telling. It's not a confession or anything. It's not, a gotcha or anything, but I think it's reality. They're not a finished product. And frankly, I think they have this, at least this is how I see it. This is not what they've told me, but I think there's a challenging thing when you try to assess where the Colts are. We've talked about Houston a lot, and I see Houston as one step ahead of the Colts, not because they're a better team per se, but just because with the year that CJ Stroud had, you really couldn't take any other approach than to say, let's go get it. And the Colts, I think, are a step behind because Anthony didn't play enough. It doesn't mean that he can't have the same kind of impact. I mean, he clearly can. But it's one thing when it's more tangible and it's already happened and you've seen it. And it's at that point, it's a lot easier to say, let's go for the jugular. Let's go get it. To the extent that they have, right? I mean, I don't know that they're going to be in the Super Bowl this year, the Houston Texans, but they certainly have made some upgrades. So, but at the same time, with the Colts, it's not like you can just say, we'll just see how it goes. No, you've got a veteran team. You have a quarterback you profess to love. You have invested richly in your own players. Your core is back. So there's kind of this dilemma. They're not at the end of their window or toward the end of the window, but there's also a window open to a degree. So how they govern themselves, I think, is very interesting right now. But I can understand why it's a challenge to know how to proceed. it's a very interesting situation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it absolutely does. And I think another thing with Chris is they've really never been in salary cap hell since he came in 2017. They always are like one of the top 5-10 teams in salary cap space. And seeing at this point in the offseason, like you said, the offseason is a long game for them. Like to not have that flexibility had I'm sure bothered them a little bit. But yeah, like you said, that doesn't mean there's something coming. It's not necessarily imminent, but if they wanted to, they sure can. But yeah, coming up here, we'll talk about, draft's a couple days away now. How do we see things shaking out? What do we think might happen with them? Because again, they're an interesting team. BPA, not a ton of crazy needs, and they're a team that loves to trade back. But again, they're one of the more interesting X factors really in this entire draft. This next segment is brought to us by our sponsor, BetterHelp. Sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off our chest. Big or small, certain things can really start to get to you. It's important to let that out, especially to someone who is unbiased in your life. It's not just going to be your mom telling you need to go out and get some fresh air, sweetie. It's someone who is looking at it from all angles for you. Therapy can be different for everybody. And again, like we said, big or small, most of us have bigger problems than our favorite sports team and their effect on our mental health. It's important to get things off your chest every once in a while. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off of your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. And of course, it's playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball is in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on everything. Right now, new customers, you guys get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. Bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, Steven. So the $1 million question, putting you on the spot. Honestly, I'm racking my brain and I'm putting myself through it over these next couple of days. I just I feel like I have I don't want to say a specific position. I think they're going to prioritize, if it presents itself, them getting more explosive. And if they can trade back, I think they would love to do that.
Yeah. I think if this draft is as deep as we think it is, I do think the trade back scenario is very much in play. First of all, it's always in play. Mm-hmm. This is Chris Ballard, right? Yeah. And so it's really going to depend on how appealing the available players are at 15 to the teams behind you, right? Can you get a sweet deal to move down because somebody who is really appealing is falling? Will there be an appealing quarterback fall at that point? I mean, I guess that's always possible. I mean, there's enough quarterbacks in play that you could get a scenario like that. So I guess, they gotta push for, they gotta, I guess, root for as many quarterbacks as possible to go 1 through 14. And then maybe there's one left that's interesting. And then somebody feels the pressure at 15, right? I mean, that would be ideal. But anyhow, so aside from the trade down scenario, I do really subscribe to, I know everyone says this all the time, best player available, but very few teams actually really do that in practice, right? This is a scenario where I really think you can actually do that and sleep just fine that night. There's only a handful of positions where I would be left scratching my head. I think offensive line, even though we know that that's always a priority for Chris Ballard, right? But they have a completely intact offensive line, which no one in the NFL ever has, right? They have that. So that would surprise me, particularly because you have even Ryan Kelly, for example, saying, look, I'm actually down to come back for a couple more years, which I was wondering about. But if that's the case, I mean, the core of your offensive line is in really good shape. So I don't see that. I certainly don't see like a running back, but
No.
I would have said that even if it were a need. I wouldn't say that in the first round. Beyond that, I think, quarterback, thank God.
Right.
And then I don't know that beyond that, I mean, anything else is kind of fair game. I really do think that. I think we haven't talked enough, maybe not you, but generally, I don't know if we've talked enough about edge rush. For me, I'm not advocating for it, but we're just trying to profile the Colts here, right? And ultimately, for me, I can't get past the reality that they threw $50 million or whatever it was at Danielle Hunter. I mean, that happened not that long ago. And I get that he's a unique situation. You're not getting Danielle Hunter in the draft, most likely, at least not initially. So that's a unique situation. You can get a Pro Bowl player who is eminently productive, but so that's going to cost you money, and they saw the value in that. But it also says something about the way you view your pass rush. You can't just ignore that they did that even after a year when they had very good pass rush production. So I think it says something, number one, about the importance of that position to them, and also perhaps about how they see that unit in the next year to 2 years, that pass rush unit. So that's really something I think that we cannot lose sight of in sort of forecasting what they do. And beyond that, obviously, we've talked about cornerback. I think you mentioned earlier how the draft stacks up well with what they need. They could be in position there to have the guy they want. I mean, they could have carte blanche at cornerback potentially, whether it's Mitchell, whether it's someone else, right? I mean, they're well positioned right there because, as Chris Ballard said, the offensive players are going to be coming off the board quickly early on. The quarterbacks, the receivers. I mean, if you have 4 quarterbacks, for argument's sake, in the top 10, 3 receivers potentially, or at least in the top 12 or something like that. I mean, you're talking about 7 or 8 players in the first 10 to 13 picks already accounted for. So they're going to be well positioned on defense, and that's where the value could well be for the Colts once they get to 15. So anyway, in terms of what I think in terms of position player, it's really wide open and hard to forecast at 15, but they're very well positioned, and they have very few positions I think should be off the table just because it's not a luxury pick, but you're just making yourself a better team, frankly. That's all this is. I know that's a dull answer, but it's kind of where they are.
Yeah, I'll say that's what it is with them, because again, they do tend to draft for need, but the BPA thing is they don't have a roster that's like bereft of talent. They don't have that quarterback, or like they don't have anywhere on the roster where you're like, oh God, they don't have anything here. And I think you're right with the edge defender thing. Like, sure that Danielle Hunter is already an established guy in the NFL. You know what you're getting, but like that big of a financial attempt doesn't come without wanting to do something to the position. And, Kwity Paye, Samson Ebukam, and Dio Dangbo are all scheduled to be free agents in the next 2 years. I mean, Kwity, if they don't pick up his 5th-year option, then it's him and Dio next year. And I mean, realistically, you're probably going to lose at least one of those guys, and that's your top 3 edge rushers. So I also got to think, knowing Chris and his tendencies like we do, if the top edge rusher in the draft falls in his lap, is he going to ignore that? Like that's he wants to build through the trenches, and if you have a potentially elite edge rusher, like I don't know that he'll pass that up. But you're right. Like what could happen in front of them? 4 quarterbacks probably. This is a really good offensive line draft as well. You could have 3 or 4 offensive linemen go ahead, and then if you add in the 3 receivers that no one expects to be there at 15, like they do really have just their pick of the litter potentially. And with that, I don't know if I'm really projecting a position they're going to take. It's more of like a hunk of like 5 guys who I think just fit them so well. And we know what they try to do. If there's a glob of guys they love, they'll try to trade back to the end of the glob to not miss out on any of them, or
Right.
so they can still get who they want. But that's kind of where I'm at. I genuinely have no idea what position it's going to be. I just think it's going to be their best available of this hunk of guys they like.
I do wonder, look, we always talk about Chris Ballard trading back, but this is kind of a random thought. I do think, though, that I wonder if he'll be less motivated this year. I kind of asked him this, recently, and I don't know if he answered it clearly, but I guess, look, there's how many roster spots are up for grabs, do you think, in training camp on this team? I think it's going to be a lower number than we're accustomed to. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be competitive. It should be, you should have a competitive training camp, and guys should feel like their jobs are on the line, because otherwise, what are we doing? But I do think the reality is, they profess themselves, right? We re-signed everybody because we like our players. So there's probably, I don't know, I'd have to look at the roster to do this, but of 53 spots, how many do you think are probably pretty well spoken for, right? I'd say a good 35 or so are probably pretty well spoken for in April. Okay. So, I wonder what that means in terms of trying to acquire more picks, in terms of signing a big undrafted class, for example, all those kinds of things. I do wonder what that means. And then they have some younger guys, like in the secondary, for example, who haven't played a lot, and but they have high hopes for example, right? And maybe they still got to prove themselves, but they have optimism about their development. So once you do the math, not a lot of spots available, right? So going into this with 7 picks, I think they're fine with the 7. But look, you're never going to say no to more picks, but I would just say they don't have to go overboard, in my view. Whether Chris Ballard agrees, that's up to him. We'll see.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Is we will see. So yeah, that's it for us today. Thursday night, I think 8:00. Friday, Saturday. We're going to spend a lot of time together for 3 days, Steven. I hope you're ready for it.
Well, hopefully we got some good catered food, and that at least makes it a little more tolerable.
That's true. Yeah, we need the coffee machine ready, and we need whatever good food they're ready to bring in. That's all we need. So yeah, thanks everybody for hopping in today. We'll be back with you throughout the week, and of course, wall-to-wall stuff for the draft. Steven has always got you plugged in over at ESPN, and of course, they're on X, Twitter, whatever it is, at Holder Steven. If you guys don't already, follow at Locked On Colts, follow Steven, at Jake Arthur NFL, and at ZachX2 on Twitter. Also, be sure to subscribe on YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts. 5-star ratings and reviews as well. We would love it. And with that, we will see you guys tomorrow.